First time at home alone. I remember it like it was yesterday. My mother had gone with my sister, probably to the grocery store, leaving me home alone for the first time. I felt grown up, in control, ready to handle it all. From afar, I looked out the living room window. I saw him, a man, his face partially hidden in the shadows, standing still, watching. The house felt different now. It was colder and eerily quiet. Minutes passed, and suddenly the back door creaked open. Panic surged through me as I got up from the table. I didn't know what to do, only that I needed to hide fast. The living room was only a few steps away from the dining room, where the back door was. I couldn't risk running there. Instead, I slid under the couch, squeezing into the tight space. It was dusty under there, making it hard to breathe. In the silence, his footsteps on the hardwood floor were deafening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to stay silent. I thought about the phone, the old corded phone sitting on the side table, right next to the couch. My fingers brushed the phone cord, and I gently pulled it, hoping to make no noise. My heart pounded in my chest. The phone slid off the table, and in an instant, it fell to the floor. The phone didn't land on a soft surface like I had hoped. Instead, it hit the hardwood floor with a thud. He must have heard it. I froze. My worst fear became reality when the man's footsteps suddenly stopped. Then, I heard a slow, cautious step as he made his way back to the living room. Each footstep was punctuated by the creak of the wooden floor. I tried to press myself deeper into the shadows under the couch. The phone was only a few millimeters away. The cord stretched tight like a lifeline for me. He was so close now. I could see his shoes from my hiding spot, worn and covered in dirt. He stopped near the edge of the couch. I bit my lip to keep from making any noise. The man started moving again, this time slower, as if he was searching for something. He remained standing near the couch. I watched in terror as he bent down slightly, his dirty hands reaching under the cushions as if searching for something. If he just looked down, he would see me. He suddenly stopped, then bent down again, this time looking at the floor. I could hear him muttering something like, "You won't get away." I couldn't hold on to the phone cord any longer, and it slipped from my hand, softly falling onto the carpet. But even that tiny sound made him stop. I was trapped, and I felt like I might pass out from holding my breath. He looked down at the floor again, and I could finally see his face clearly. I felt lucky the couch was dark and long enough that he couldn't see me from the other side. At that moment, he moved again, this time toward the kitchen, away from me. I let out a quiet breath. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing as he disappeared into the darkness. My muscles started cramping from lying under the couch for so long. Every second was torture as I waited and listened, trying to figure out how to call the police. He was ransacking the rooms, likely searching for something valuable. The sounds of his rummaging grew louder and more aggressive. My hands fumbled for the phone again, pulling it closer. I whispered as quietly as I could, explaining that someone had broken into my house and that I was hiding under the couch. I gave them my address. Minutes passed like hours as I lay there, clutching the phone as if it were my lifeline. I couldn't hear the man anymore. Had he left? Then, a noise. From the end of the hallway. He was still here, somewhere in the back of the house. Then, I saw the police outside, surrounding my house. I was taken outside to safety. The man had tried to escape through the backyard, but they caught him. Relief flooded through me. The whole experience felt like a nightmare. Afterward, I didn't want to be home alone for a long time. Looking back, I still can't believe how lucky I was. I did what I had to do, and I'll never forget it. Strange disappearance. This happened about 2 years ago when my sister Jan was studying at a university. She was shy, and not the kind of person who would stay out late or hang out with friends. One day, she went to school as usual. It was 5 p.m., and John hadn't come home yet. I thought she was probably studying since she was always so diligent. Around 6:30, I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. I texted her, but there was no response. I told my parents, and they said not to worry, she wasn't a child anymore. But I had a strange feeling. Around 7 p.m. when I tried calling again, her phone was off. That was odd because Jan always answered my calls or, at the very least, texted me back. By 10 p.m., my parents had come home, and there was still no sign of Jan. Now even they were worried. We tried contacting her classmates, but they said she hadn't attended any classes that day. My parents and I went to the police to report her missing, but their search was in vain. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. 3 months passed with no sign of Jan. Our house, once warm, now felt cold and empty, haunted by her absence. Then, in December, it was a normal school day, the last day of my senior year. As I walked home, I couldn't believe my eyes. I saw her Jan standing at the corner of the street. I ran to her, calling her name, and she saw me. She started crying. I immediately brought her home, knowing my parents would be overjoyed to see her safe. When I walked in with her, my parents were shocked to see us. The house burst with emotion as my parents rushed to hug Jan. My mom cried, and my dad's face went pale with disbelief. But Jan's reaction was strange. She stood there, stiff, her arms hanging limply at her sides as if she didn't know how to respond. I thought she needed time to adjust after everything she had gone through. That night, I nervously brought her to her room. I had to ask what had happened to her during those 3 months. I tried to stay calm and not overwhelm her with questions. I asked her where she had been. She gave me a chilling smile and said she had been kidnapped. Then I asked how she escaped, and I was horrified by her answer. Jan told me it was easy. She had killed her captor, stabbing him until he stopped breathing. A shiver ran down my spine. The way she said it, without any emotion or compassion, this wasn't the Jan I knew. The days that followed were strange. Jan seemed more distant than before. One night, while Jan was still recovering from her trauma, I suddenly thought of a question that had never crossed my mind before. I hesitantly asked, "If you did that, where is the body of your kidnapper?" She turned to me and started smiling. She told me,
"On the outskirts of the city, there's a forest, and in that forest, there's a small cupboard. Inside that cupboard is his body."
I ran straight to my parents and told them everything. The next morning, we went to the police station, and they took us to the location Jan had described, just as she told me. The forest was dark and overgrown. We arrived, and there was a metal cupboard in the woods, just as Jan had said. The police opened it and found a rotting corpse, wearing the clothes and belongings of my sister, Jan. I couldn't believe my eyes. As I watched, the police took the body for forensic investigation, and it was confirmed the corpse was indeed my sister. As the truth came to light, fear overwhelmed my family. My parents, devastated, initially refused to believe it, but now everything was clear. That night, I snuck into Jan's room, trying to find any clue about who or what she really was. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had touched it. She was gone, leaving nothing behind. It's been 2 years since that night, and I've always felt sadness and sorrow for my sister. That person, I've never seen her again. I will never know who impersonated my sister or why they did it. And it makes me wonder what would have happened if we had never discovered the truth. That thought is terrifying. The Stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
Someone like her with someone like you?
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. The graveyard shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with the daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened. And tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. When I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me, his eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. The Window Stalker. It all started that day, when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice, "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, In the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard it and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. Whispers behind the door. It's been 9 years since that happened, but I still remember it clearly. In the middle of the city, I rented a small apartment in an old, damp-smelling building. With my job as a waiter, it was all I could afford, just enough to get by. Not long after, something strange began to happen. It started with small noises, almost unnoticeable at first. A faint voice, muttering in the middle of the night. I remember waking up that first night, the sound barely audible, like someone whispering on the other side of the wall. The walls weren't well insulated, so I could hear it. At first, I thought it was a dream. The voice was too distant to make out clearly. But soon, the words became clearer, sharper. "Go die." The words echoed in the dark, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, every hair on my neck standing on end. Who would say such a thing? My eyes darted toward the door. I got out of bed, quietly stepping toward the peephole. Slowly, I saw a thin man, shirtless, his face twisted into a wide, terrifying smile. His hand scratched slowly at the door with a single finger, the gentle sound of it sending chills through me. He just stood there, scratching the door and whispering. From that day on, the man became a frequent, unwelcome visitor. Every 2 or 3 nights, he would return, scratching at my door, mumbling, and sometimes singing in a shrill, childlike voice. The sound was terrifying, like a nightmarish lullaby. Every time I looked through the peephole, there he was, whispering threats. I thought about confronting him, flinging the door open, and demanding he stop. But I couldn't see his hands, they were out of view, and I feared he might be holding something dangerous. The mumbling stopped. Everything was silent. I leaned forward, cautiously pressing my ear against the door. Then a loud knock startled me. sending me falling backward. He said,
I know you're there. Be careful.
but in the daytime, it was as if nothing had happened between us. I'd run into him in the hallway, and he would smile politely, nod, and walk away. I even asked him once why he kept coming to my door at night. He seemed surprised, then confused, denying any knowledge of what I was talking about. One night, I was about to sleep, but I had to grab something from the living room. The mumbling started again, but this time, it felt much closer. I crept toward the bedroom door, checking to make sure it was locked. Thank God it was. But the doorknob turned slowly, rattling as if he was testing it. Then silence for a long while. I didn't know how he had gotten in. I was terrified, but after the silence lasted long enough, I decided to go out and check. I stepped outside. From the corner near the door, I saw my thin neighbor banging his head against the wall, singing something I couldn't understand. I was truly frightened. I tried to talk to him, but he only turned and threatened me. I stumbled back, startled, but he wasn't hurt. He just kept grinning and eventually walked out of the apartment by himself. I decided I had had enough and finally called the police. They took him to a psychiatric ward. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had escaped from a mental hospital 2 months earlier. Apparently, he had a violent history. In fact, he had been admitted after attacking a mailman with a shovel and had snuck out undetected. Now I live in another city, far from that building, far from the memories of those nights. But sometimes, I still can't sleep well, unable to shake the feeling that he might come back. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock a.m. I stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze, facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse, but just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on, illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist. I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again. Horror Story Red Bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads. They slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait!
The man called out, "And now." She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted, "Help me! Help!" As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?
I replied,
I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue.
She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. The uninvited guest. Ava and her fiancé, Jay, decided to host a dinner party to celebrate his mother's recovery. The house was bustling with final touches on the decorations, ensuring everything was ready. She had hired a server to assist her in serving their family and friends. The server arrived on time as scheduled. As soon as he walked in, Ava noticed an unpleasant odor coming from him, which made her uncomfortable, especially since he would be preparing food for her family, but she forced a polite smile. As the server unpacked his utensils, he kept glancing at Ava, asking for her opinion on spices, telling her to taste the food, and seeking her input on presentation. But she politely said she trusted his taste, as he was the chef after all. Soon it was 5:45 p.m. Guests were about to arrive, yet he was still there. After reminding him twice, she bluntly told him she needed him to finish everything and be out by 6 o'clock. He apologized, claiming her oven wasn't maintaining the right temperature, a problem Ava had never encountered before. As guests started arriving, the server finally began packing up his things. But instead of heading to the door, he suddenly walked toward Ava's bedroom. Ava, confused and worried, called after him and asked where he was going. He mumbled something about needing to change clothes. Feeling uncomfortable, she told him there was another bathroom outside, but he ignored her and went inside, locking the door. Ava found Jay and explained the strange behavior she had noticed from the server. Together, they went to the room and demanded he come out. When he appeared, he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, but his expression darkened. "This isn't your house." Jay told him that he was Ava's fiancé and they lived there. The server went berserk, screaming about how Ava had seduced him, babbling nonsense that she couldn't understand. Then, he rushed into the kitchen, throwing food out of the fridge and onto the floor without hesitation. He screamed obscenities, his face twisted with rage. Jay had to call on his two brothers to forcibly remove the server. Fortunately, the party still proceeded as planned. Around 5 a.m., Ava woke with a start to the sound of a door creaking open. She nudged Jay awake, whispering that someone was inside the house. He tried to reassure her, saying maybe his brother had forgotten something like his wallet. But then, the noise grew louder, coming from outside. Jay told her he'd check it out while she should hide in the closet and call 911. Before she could dial, a familiar, disturbing voice echoed through the room. She stepped into the living room and saw the server, shirtless, his eyes wild with madness. He lunged at Ava, but Jay blocked him, holding him down while she called the police. Jay warned the server, "The police are on their way," but the server just smiled. "I need to make sure she's okay and unharmed." Jay stayed between them as Ava climbed out of the window. The server broke free from Jay's grip and ran into the kitchen. Just in time, when the police arrived, the server was in the kitchen, swinging a knife wildly. He ignored the police's orders to drop the weapon, forcing them to subdue him with a taser. The police searched the entire house, finding nothing unusual except one thing. Ava suddenly remembered that he had gone into her room. Upon checking, she realized some of her clothes and personal items were missing. Afterward, Ava and Jay cleaned the house, discarding everything the server had touched. They replaced all the kitchen items and made the house feel like home again. The server was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but the trauma and violation he caused still haunted Ava. She was grateful, though, that Jay had stood by her and protected her, helping her recover from the emotional ordeal. Mysterious Treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and notice the mess tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody,
There's nothing here. We should leave.
but Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
We need to go. Now.
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute.
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. Mysterious man at the fast food restaurant. I had been working at this 24-hour fast food restaurant for years. Most of my night shifts were quiet. However, tonight was different. The night started like any normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Our night cook called in sick, leaving me to manage the whole restaurant alone until someone could assist at 4 a.m. The silence in the restaurant was eerie. With no customers around, I spent time cleaning the kitchen, focusing on scrubbing away the grime. Then, I heard a loud noise coming from the front of the restaurant. There was a man outside the entrance. He was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, peering inside and banging on the door. He didn't seem normal, which made me feel uneasy. The door was locked, I approached the glass, trying to stay calm, and gestured for him to go around to the drive-thru. He didn't respond, just stared. I shouted through the glass that the dining area was closed, but he didn't move, just stood there, lifeless. I turned and went back to the kitchen. I tried to continue working, focusing on my tasks. 15 minutes passed, and I convinced myself that he must have left. But the unease still lingered. A beep went off in my headset. Someone had placed an order. I turned on the mic and asked for their order, but all I got was silence. I checked the camera at the drive-thru lane, no car, no sign of anyone. I sighed and turned away, but then I froze. I heard something footsteps, light, careful steps coming from above, as if someone was walking on the roof. I tracked the noise until it stopped at the ladder leading to the maintenance door in the ceiling. The footsteps halted above. I was sure someone was up there. I quickly searched for a lock or anything to secure the door. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure if it could even lock. I heard the trapdoor creak. It was slowly beginning to open. A small gap appeared, and through it, I saw a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring at me. Panic consumed me, and without thinking, I turned and ran toward the front door. I bolted outside to my car, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Trembling, I called the police and described what was happening. From the safety of my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my eyes scanning the windows, and then I saw him. A shadow moving near the counter. For a moment, he looked directly at me, then suddenly darted into the kitchen. The police arrived and searched the entire building, inside and out, even checking the roof. But the man had vanished, disappeared as if he had never been there. Nothing was stolen. No money, no equipment, nothing was missing. He had broken in, but he didn't take anything from the restaurant, like a strange stalker. After the police left, I sat in my car, staring at the darkened restaurant. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw him look at me in such a strange and unsettling way. I went back to work. My boss had installed a lock on the ceiling door, a safety measure that should have been done long ago. But my job was never the same. From then on, I startled at every sound, never knowing if he would come back. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind. But I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. The hitchhiker's nightmare. The chilly spring air bit at my skin. It was a quiet night as I left the Subway restaurant. The shopping mall where the Subway was located was desolate, except for a few dim streetlights casting pale circles of light over the empty parking lot. Though the place was somewhat old and empty, the quality was decent, and it was only a 5 to 10 minute drive from my house. As I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man walking past the stores. He was tall, disheveled, wearing sweatpants and a dingy t-shirt. As he passed by the window, he glanced at me. It was only a brief look, but something about him left me feeling uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy. I pushed open the door, my breath visible in the cold night air, and started walking the short distance to my car. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, they were faint, but they quickly grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the man from earlier. He was walking toward me, and before I knew it, he was right next to me. I stopped, unsure of what he wanted. He was too close for comfort. He asked me for a ride to the gas station just down the street. His voice was calm, almost friendly, as he pointed toward a gas station nearby, visible from where we stood. It didn't seem far, and it was on my way home. Though I hesitated, the cold air and his seemingly urgent demeanor convinced me to agree. I got into my car, and the man sat in the passenger seat. I drove out of the parking lot, down the empty streets, making the short drive to the gas station. Neither of us said a word. The entire time, something felt off about the situation. I kept telling myself everything was fine, it was just a quick ride, after all. When we arrived at the gas station, I parked in the back of the lot. I expected him to get out right away, but he didn't. Seconds passed in uncomfortable silence, and my anxiety grew. I said, "All right, we're here," trying to sound casual, hoping he would leave, but he didn't move. The man stared straight ahead, making no move to get out of the car. My heart started pounding as I repeated myself, this time more firmly. "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" Finally, he spoke. His tone had changed. It was no longer friendly, but cold, almost irritated. He told me this wasn't the right gas station, and that he needed to go to a different one farther away. I glanced at the gas station in front of us, confused and worried. I was sure this was the place he pointed to. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I told him I wasn't going any farther and that I needed to go home. The man didn't reply. He just sat there, silent. The tension in the car was building. and I could feel my pulse quickening. I asked him to get out, my voice now shaky. He refused and said no. I glanced around the gas station, looking for someone who might help. A few cars were parked under the bright lights, but I didn't dare move. He seemed stubborn, and I was scared he might harm me. I felt trapped, like the walls of the car were closing in on me. Suddenly, a noise broke the tension, a car door slamming nearby. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a woman stepping out of her car, walking toward the gas station store. Seeing someone else, even from a distance, gave me a brief surge of courage. I turned back to him, my voice stronger this time. "I need you to get out of my car, right now." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said he wouldn't get out until I took him where he needed to go. I couldn't take him anywhere else, and I couldn't sit there any longer with the fear gnawing at me. I glanced back at the gas station, hoping someone would look my way, but no one did. I needed an exit, and fast. I reached for my phone, trying to act as casual as possible. I said, "Okay," to buy myself some time, pretending to check the GPS for the other gas station he claimed he wanted to go to. He said nothing, but his eyes never left me. As my hand fumbled for the phone in my pocket, I could feel his gaze, watching my every move. My heart raced as I unlocked my phone, pretending to look up directions. In reality, I was opening the keypad. My mind raced, calculating how quickly I could call for help without him noticing. But before I could act, he suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my wrist. Panic exploded in my chest. He squeezed my wrist painfully as he leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. I tried to pull away, but he held me tight. His voice was cold, threatening, telling me not to even think about it. I froze. My breath became shallow as I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. The gas station lights cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look even more terrifying. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a police car pulling into the gas station, its headlights sweeping over the parking lot. The other man must have seen it too, because his hand suddenly loosened my wrist. Without warning, he let go of my wrist, opened the door, and got out of the car. He didn't look back, just walked quickly into the darkness behind the gas station. For a few minutes, I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My wrist throbbed where he had grabbed me, but I was too shaken to focus on the pain. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I didn't want to stay there any longer. Without looking back, I drove out of the parking lot and onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, my mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail etched into my memory. What did he want? What would have happened if the police hadn't shown up? One thing was certain, I would never make the mistake of letting a stranger into my car again. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the silence of my car for a long time, staring out at the empty street. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to fully feel the fear. After resting for a bit, I was scrolling through the web to calm my nerves when I stumbled upon complaint and wanted reports about a man who looked exactly like the one I had encountered. He was known for tricking people into giving him rides, then using various methods to steal something he wanted after following his victims. Using the phone number I found in the article, I immediately reported to the local police where I last saw him, right that same night. Thank God, I realized how lucky I was to have escaped that mysterious man and survived. Lucky that the police had been there. Lucky that I hadn't driven him farther and made it home safely. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. The house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, the woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever roll. In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children, still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. Stranger at the campsite. A woman, Lena, in her 20s, stood at the edge of the familiar trail leading to her campsite. Her hiking backpack was slung over her shoulders, and a neatly rolled up tent was strapped to it. She breathed in the fresh air, savoring the tranquility of nature. Lena had been camping here for years, escaping the monotony of her small town. The forest was her refuge, Lena moved forward, following the trail leading to the lake. The setting sun filtered through the trees. She felt at home here, but today, a strange unease crept into her chest. As Lena rounded the corner and arrived at the clearing by the lake, her heart skipped a beat. Standing near the water's edge was a man. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing regular swim trunks and a faded white t-shirt. His small tent was already set up, not far from where hers would be. He was staring out across the lake, his back turned to her. Lena hesitated for a moment. She usually camped alone, and seeing someone else here made her feel uneasy. With a slight shrug, she moved a little further from his tent and began setting up her own. She gathered large stones, arranging them into a neat circle to prepare for her campfire later. As she was absorbed in her work, she noticed movement. The man was no longer facing the lake. He was staring directly at her, standing eerily still. Lena's heart raced. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her campfire. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. Her discomfort grew. She awkwardly raised her hand and waved. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he wanted to say hello. But after a moment of silence, the man simply turned and walked along the shore without acknowledging her. Lena frowned. Something about him didn't feel right, but she shook off the thought. She grabbed a chair and sat by the shore, determined to relax and enjoy the view. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Lena packed up her chair and returned to her campsite. She started a campfire, hoping to relax after the strange encounter. As she stared into the flames, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. A figure stood in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was the man in the white shirt. He had returned, standing there, watching from a distance. Lena quickly shifted her chair to the other side of the fire so she could face him. Time passed slowly. The man stood frozen in place as the forest around them grew darker. The shadows deepened, and soon, his figure became blurry, blending into the trees. Even though it was dark, Lena knew he was still there. He could see her clearly, illuminated by the fire, but she could no longer see him. Fear gnawed at her. What was he doing? Why hadn't he returned to his tent? Hours passed, and Lena remained tense, staring into the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and distant crickets. She considered leaving but feared the man might follow her, keeping her rooted in place. She stoked the fire, ensuring it burned brightly, knowing it was her only way to keep the surrounding darkness at bay. Lena sat by the campfire, her face blurred in the flickering firelight. The night was already thick with shadows. The forest around her was a pitch-black void. Her eyes continuously turned to the tree line where the man stood. Even though she could no longer see him, she knew he was still out there, following, waiting. Suddenly, a tree branch broke nearby. Lena stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her camp, squinting into the darkness. Perhaps he has already arrived. The flames cast long, flickering shadows. Lena couldn't stop imagining shapes moving among the trees. There, at the edge of the tree line, someone was probably standing there because she always heard footsteps crunching through the forest. Then slowly, the man's silhouette appeared. She regained her determination, suddenly stood up, picked up a thick branch from the fire, and held it as a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He remained still, watching her as if waiting for her next move. Lena shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling but firm, asking who he was and what he wanted from her. But there was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by her defiance. Lena's skin prickled with fear. She gripped the burning branch tightly and stepped closer to the edge of the campfire, ready to defend herself. But then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest. Slowly, cautiously. His footsteps were eerily soft. Lena watched him go, not daring to follow. He disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. She didn't believe he was truly gone. The night dragged on. Lena struggled to stay alert, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with fear. The fire had burned down, casting only a faint light. Despite her best efforts, her eyes began to droop. She couldn't fight it any longer. After only a short while, Lena was startled awake by a faint sound, her eyes snapping open. The fire was nearly out. Only a few embers remained. The air was cold and damp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had imagined the sound. But then she heard the faint rustling sound again, this time coming from behind the tent. Lena's heart raced. She stood up slowly, creeping carefully to avoid making any noise. She grabbed a nearly burnt-out branch from the fire, gripping it tightly. She cautiously walked around the tent, following the sound. The rustling grew louder as she approached the back of the tent. Lena tightened her grip on the branch. She took a deep breath and rounded the tent, only to find a squirrel nibbling away. The area behind the tent was empty. Lena frowned, confused. She could have sworn she heard something like footsteps. She returned to the fire, scanning the surroundings. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Lena's body was stiff from sitting for hours, her eyes heavy from the sleepless night. It seemed like she was very lucky. For some reason, the man never returned, and she saw no sign of him for hours. But the insecurity is still there. Lena quickly packed her things, wasting no time. She glanced nervously at the tree line. The forest remained quiet and still, as if the events of the previous night had never happened, and she wished that were true. She slung her backpack over her shoulders and began walking briskly toward her car. Her legs trembled. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made her jump, but the trail remained empty. As Lena neared the parking lot, she began to feel a sense of relief. She could see her car up ahead, the only vehicle in sight. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the forest and the strange man behind. But as she reached the clearing, she froze in her tracks. His tent was still there. She slowly, cautiously, walked toward it. The tent flap was slightly open, the inside dark, but there was nothing there. Lena backed away, her mind racing. What kind of game was this? Was he even real? She snapped out of it and hurried toward her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she started the engine, and drove off. As Lena sped down the winding road, she glanced into her rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the man in the white shirt. His hand was raised, thumb out, as if hitchhiking. Lena pressed the gas pedal harder, her car speeding away, and she never looked back or returned to that forest again. It left her with an unforgettable memory, perhaps the worst camping trip she'd ever had. The troublemaker at Starbucks. Lai had just graduated from college and found a temporary job, which left her struggling to find a place to live. Lai rented a small apartment near a Starbucks, where she worked as a barista. Starbucks was a hangout spot for local musicians and artists, the kind of crowd who knew their coffee. It stayed open until midnight, sometimes even later on weekends. Lai worked the night shift, a shift most employees weren't fond of. The pay was decent, though not great, but the shifts were quiet. However, there was always something unsettling about the empty cafe late at night, especially toward closing time. She spent most of her time cleaning and making coffee to keep herself busy. Nick, a friend of Lai's, would sometimes drop by to keep her company. He knew everyone who worked there. But one summer night, everything changed. Nick wasn't there that evening. He didn't show up because he was attending a friend's wedding, leaving Lai to face the night shift alone. By midnight, she had made only $10 in tips, and the store was almost entirely empty, but she felt grateful that she didn't have to deal with any difficult customers. She went to the back room to fill the mop bucket and started cleaning the floor. The silence was peaceful, but something felt off. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow pass by the front window. Lai glanced up, but no one was there. She called out, asking if anyone was there, thinking a customer had come in through the back door, but there was no response. After a moment of hesitation, she shrugged, thinking she had imagined it, and went back to cleaning behind the counter. Suddenly, she heard the bathroom door open. Lai's heart started pounding, and she felt uneasy. She hadn't seen anyone come in, and the store had been completely empty just minutes before. To her surprise, Nick walked out of the bathroom. A wave of relief washed over her, and she smiled, calling out,
Nick, what are you doing here?
He grinned back at her, saying he had just dropped by after the wedding, but something in his expression had changed. His usual friendly demeanor had turned into something unsettling. She gave an awkward smile, brushing off the strange feeling, and offered him a drink. As she started making an espresso, Lai glanced at him. He was staring at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Lai tried to act normal and asked him what he was up to. Nick didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. His smile widened as he tossed it onto the counter. She stared at it, confused, asking what it was. Nick leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. He said he had recorded something Lai wouldn't want anyone else to see. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He stood up straight, crossing his arms. Nick threatened her about some private conversations she had with her boss. Panic started to rise in her, and she yelled that he was lying. Nick shook his head, his smile never fading. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if he was lying, but the confidence in his voice made it clear that he wasn't. He chuckled softly, stepping closer. He spoke to Lai with crude words. He had initially planned to blackmail her, but now he didn't need to, and he thought it was time for Lai to show some appreciation for all the nights he'd kept her company. A nauseating feeling rose in Lai's throat as she realized what he was implying. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, screaming that he was insane and that she hadn't done anything. Nick's smile turned sinister. Her hands trembled, barely able to breathe as she tried to figure out how to escape. The store was closed, and the doors were locked. She was alone with him, and he was moving in, ready to corner her. She backed away and pleaded with him. His expression darkened, saying he had spent too much time helping without getting anything in return. He reached behind his back and pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for a way to escape. Her eyes landed on the espresso machine, and an idea formed in her mind. Lai tried to stall him and suggested making him a cup of coffee first. Nick raised an eyebrow but didn't object. She hurried behind the counter, her hands trembling as she poured an espresso. Her heart raced as she reached for the panini press. Without warning, Lai grabbed it and swung it at Nick's head with all her strength. The metal struck the side of his skull, and he staggered back, dropping the knife. Blood trickled down his face, and he let out a groan of pain. But the blow wasn't enough to bring him down. She needed to act fast. Lai ran around the counter, her eyes fixed on Nick as he wiped the blood from his face and started moving toward her. She frantically scanned the room for another weapon or an escape. Nick moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew Lai had nowhere to run. His smile had vanished, replaced by a grim expression. She backed up toward the rear of the cafe, her mind racing to come up with a plan. The mop bucket was still near the back door. If only she could reach it. With trembling hands, She lunged for the mop bucket, grabbed the metal handle, and swung it at him. Nick dodged the first blow, but she swung again, striking him in the ribs. He groaned in pain, stumbling backward. She didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for his legs. It sent Nick crashing to the ground with a pained yell, clutching his knee. She seized the opportunity and ran for the back door. Lai fumbled with the lock as Nick struggled to get up. She finally managed to open the door and dashed out into the alley behind the store. She kept running, too afraid to look back as she heard Nick's footsteps behind her. He was limping, but he was still chasing her. Lai rounded a corner and spotted a large metal dumpster near the end of the alley. She crouched behind it, holding her breath. Her heart was pounding so fast it felt like it might burst out of her chest. From her hiding spot, she heard Nick stumble into the alley. His breathing was heavy, labored from the pain, and then his bitter voice called out, asking where she was, saying it wasn't over yet. Lai covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stay as silent as possible, not daring to move. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, the wail of sirens in the distance. Maybe someone had heard the commotion and called the police. Nick began limping back toward the Starbucks, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the night. Her legs were shaking so much, she could barely stand. She knew she had to leave before he came back. As she stumbled onto the street, she saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. I felt a wave of relief and waved for help. A short time later, Lai was brought to the interrogation room at the police station. The officers came in and told her that Nick had been arrested. He had been hiding in the cafe, trying to erase the security footage. The relief was immense. It was finally over. Nick had been arrested, and the evidence against him was undeniable. He would be charged with multiple crimes, including assault and attempted blackmail. The nightmare was over, and Nick would pay for everything he had done. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again, the sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nicky spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nicky stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nicky rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it, a door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching.